My neck seized when I tried to sit up, not a sharp pain, more like a clamp that had been tightening all night. I shifted in the back seat and felt my lower spine answer, with a dull, spreading ache. The windows were fogged from my breath, turning the outside into a watercolor of orange streetlights and dark shapes. I wiped a circle clear with my sleeve and saw nothing interesting. Just another quiet lot, another early hour, another day I hadn't earned yet. I'd gotten decent at sleeping in the car, which isn't something you should ever be able to say with a straight face. Jacket folded under my hip to keep the door latch from digging in. Duffel bag shoved behind my head like a pillow. Shoes still on because taking them off felt too vulnerable. The air inside the cabin smelled like stale fabric and cold coffee, and my breath came out in little white puffs that hung for a second before fading. My phone was at 2% when I picked it up. The screen lit my hands a sickly blue. I didn't even think about what I was doing. Thumb to the bank app, like checking it could change anything. The balance loaded and sat there. The number looked wrong every time, like it belonged to someone else's life. I stared at it until my eyes started to sting, then backed out and let the screen go dark again. The worst part wasn't the money. It was the way everything in my head kept circling back to one moment, like a tooth you can't stop touching with your tongue. Graham Vance's office, the glass wall, the cheap carpet, the smell of his cologne and whatever burnt sludge the break room called coffee. I hadn't planned to touch him, and I hadn't walked in thinking I'd blow up my job and my reputation in one stupid second. I'd gone in thinking I was going to say my piece and leave with my dignity intact. He didn't raise his voice. That was the thing. He leaned back in his chair, hands folded, and talked like he was explaining a policy I'd misunderstood. He kept using words like professional and appropriate and moving forward, like he was smoothing a sheet over a mess. I told him I wasn't okay with how he'd handled the situation. I told him he'd thrown me under the bus and called it leadership. My chest was tight and my hands were hot, and the room felt too small for my skin. He stood up at some point, not to threaten me, just to end it. He stepped closer, not even thinking about it, because guys like him don't think about space. They take it. Sure, he said something about consequences, not a threat, not technically. Just a reminder that he knew people, that he'd been here a long time, that I should be careful. My body moved before my brain caught up. My palm hit his chest and shoved, not hard enough to knock him down, hard enough to make him take a step back and blink like the universe had broken a rule. For half a second, his face wasn't angry. It was shocked. Then it hardened like a door slamming. "Don't touch me again," Graham Vance snapped. My ears burned. I felt suddenly childish, like I'd just proved his point for him in front of nobody. I should have walked out without saying anything. I should have swallowed my pride and left with at least the illusion that I was in control. But my mouth opened anyway. "I'm done," I said, and my voice came out flatter than I meant it to. I walked out without slamming the door. That detail haunted me later, because it meant part of me still believed I could be reasonable about it. The hallway felt too bright. People looked up and then looked away fast. I kept my eyes forward and moved like momentum was the only thing holding me together. By the time I got to the parking lot, my hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and my throat felt raw like I'd swallowed sand. That same afternoon, my badge stopped working. The next morning I got an email with the word incident in it, like it was something neat and clinical. No mention of what he'd said, no mention of how close he'd gotten. Just me, reduced to a liability. I told myself it would blow over. I told myself I'd find something else. Reno had plenty of jobs. Reno wasn't a small town. The first few applications went out with a weird kind of optimism. I cleaned up my resume. I wrote cover letters I didn't believe in. I walked into interviews with my shoulders squared and my voice steady, like I could act normal long enough to become normal again. The recruiters smiled. They nodded. They asked the standard questions. They said I had good experience. They said they'd be in touch. Then the follow-ups didn't come. At first I blamed timing. Then I blamed myself. Maybe I sounded bitter. Maybe I looked tired. Maybe my shirt collar was wrinkled. I started overthinking every handshake and every answer. I applied to smaller places, warehouse shifts, night work, anything with a paycheck attached to it. The pattern stayed the same. Polite faces, polite words, and then silence that felt too clean to be an accident. A manager at a shop on South Virginia asked me to wait while he checked something. He walked into the back with his phone. He came out 2 minutes later and wouldn't meet my eyes. He didn't insult me. He didn't accuse me. He just ended it fast, like I was something he didn't want to hold. Another place had me fill out paperwork, then called me the next day and said they'd gone a different direction. No explanation, no stutter, like they'd practiced. By the time it happened the 5th time, I didn't need proof. I could feel it. Graham Vance didn't have to destroy me in court. He didn't have to file a report. He just had to talk to the right people, the kind of people who liked feeling connected, and let my name carry a warning. Nobody wanted trouble. Nobody wanted a guy who might shove his boss. Even if the story was missing pieces, nobody cared. It was easier to say no than to ask questions. I started hearing my own name differently, like it had weight to it, like it dragged behind me. Jack Wheeler, a thing that walked into rooms before I did. Lori Bennett texted first. Short message, too polite. Could you call me when you get a minute? Then she showed up in person, like she wanted credit for courage. She stood in the doorway of my apartment with her purse clutched tight and her eyes already apologizing. You need to be out by Friday, Lori Bennett said quietly, like she was reading weather. I stared at her. Friday was 3 days away. I hadn't even missed rent yet, not officially. I started to ask why and felt my voice catch. She gave me the kind of reasons people give when they don't want to tell you the real one. Family situation, change of plans. She needed the place back. She said it like the decision had been made somewhere else, and she was just delivering it. I could have argued. I could have talked about leases and notice periods and tenant rights, but all of that costs time and money, and I didn't have either. I could already see how it would go. Me raising my voice, her calling someone, a record created, another label stuck to my name. I was too tired to add fuel to it, so I packed like a thief in my own life. I filled the duffel first. Clothes, toothbrush, documents, anything that couldn't be replaced. Then I started leaving things behind, a chair, a lamp, books I'd moved twice and never opened. Each item became something I couldn't afford to care about. By Thursday night, the apartment looked hollow. By Friday morning, I was handing over keys and pretending I wasn't shaking. After that, the car wasn't a choice. It was the last container left. I learned which lots were quiet and which had security that liked to ask questions. I learned how to nap without really sleeping, because real sleep meant letting your guard down. I learned to keep my phone on silent but my ears open. I learned to hate sunrise because it meant another day I had to survive. I didn't tell Maya any of it. I told her I was between places. I told her I had a lead. I told her I was fine. The lies weren't dramatic. They were small, daily, and they stacked up until they felt heavier than the duffel in my back seat. That morning, sitting there with fogged windows and a stiff spine, I looked at the pale strip of sky over the lot and finally let myself accept what I'd been avoiding. Reno wasn't just a city I'd had a bad month in. It was a place where my name now came with an invisible note attached, a place where doors would close before I even touched the handle. I started the engine. The heater coughed out cold air first, then warmed up just enough to stop my fingers from going numb. I backed out slow, like I was trying not to wake the world up, and turned toward the highway without giving myself time to think. "Just keep driving," I muttered, more to myself than anyone. I kept the radio off, not because I wanted silence, but because silence was cheaper than distraction. The highway out of Reno felt familiar for the first few miles, like the city was still trying to pretend it owned me. Then, the buildings thinned, the signs got farther apart, and the world opened into long stretches of nothing that didn't care who I was. The gas needle sat just above empty, hovering like it could drop at any breath. I told myself I could stretch it. I drove slower than I wanted to, tucked behind semis when I could, let the cruise control sit a little lower than the speed limit. Every mile felt like a negotiation with the engine. I'd packed cheap food in the passenger seat, the kind that didn't require decisions. A sleeve of crackers, 2 protein bars that tasted like chalk, a bottle of water I'd been refilling from sinks, because buying a new one felt like admitting defeat. By mid-morning, my eyes started to burn. Not from crying, from sleep that never finished. The kind of sleep where you keep one part of your brain awake, listening. I'd nodded off in the car for maybe an hour before sunrise, then sat up in a panic, because I couldn't remember where I was for a second. That feeling stayed with me on the road, a thin layer of unease that made the steering wheel feel slightly slippery under my palms. I stopped at a rest area just to close my eyes again without worrying about being noticed. The lot was half full of trucks, a few sedans with people slumped in seats. I pulled into a spot that wasn't too isolated and not too close to anyone else, turned the engine off, and leaned my forehead against the wheel. My stomach growled, and I ate a protein bar without tasting it. I drank water until the bottle was light, then sat still and listened to the soft ticking of the cooling engine. My phone buzzed in my pocket and made my pulse jump, like I'd been caught doing something wrong. I looked anyway. "You there?" Maya texted. I stared at the message longer than I needed to. Maya always knew when to check in, like she could feel when my life was sliding. I wanted to tell her the truth, not all of it, just enough to feel less alone. But I pictured her face on the other end, the worry turning into questions I couldn't answer, and my chest tightened. I typed what I always typed, the version that sounded stable. "I'm fine. Just relocating," I typed back, trying to sound normal. I watched the little delivered checkmark show up and felt nothing, which was worse than guilt. Then I put the phone face down on the seat like it might start telling on me by itself. I got back on the road and kept going east, then south, following a route I'd picked because it felt far enough to matter. Grand Junction was just a dot on my map when I first looked it up, but the more I stared at it, the more it started to feel like a reset button. New streets, new faces, new managers who didn't owe Graham Vance anything. A place where my name wasn't already stamped on some invisible list. The day slid by in pieces, dry hills, wide sky, gas stations that all smelled the same. I put $20 in the tank once, then another 10 later, never filling it because I couldn't stand watching the number climb. I bought the cheapest coffee I could find and drank it too fast, then regretted it when my hand started shaking again. Every time my phone lit up, I checked it with a sick little hope that someone was offering me a job. Most of the time it was nothing. Spam, a promotional email, a notification I didn't care about. By late afternoon, the sun started to drop and my thoughts got loud. That's what happens when you're tired and moving. The brain starts running through every mistake because it thinks repetition is control. I tried not to replay the shove. I tried not to think about Lori in my doorway. I tried to focus on the next thing, not the next month, not the next year. Just the next thing that could keep me upright. That's when my phone rang with an unknown number. I almost ignored it. Unknown numbers had become bad news in my head. Debt collectors, automated systems, and people asking me to confirm things I didn't have. But something in me answered anyway, thumb sliding across the screen like it was a reflex. A man's voice came through, low and steady, like he'd made calls like this all day. He introduced himself as Drew Holbrook from Cedar Vale Lodge. The name didn't mean anything to me at first. Then it clicked. I'd fired off an application the night before from a public library computer, half asleep, filling out the forms like I was playing a game where the prize was survival. He asked a couple quick questions. Could I lift? Could I follow a checklist? Had I done basic repairs, cleaning, hauling, anything like that? I didn't oversell. I couldn't. I just told him I could show up and work and not complain. There was a pause, the kind where you can hear someone deciding if you're worth the hassle. We can start you Monday, but you'll need a place tonight," Drew Holbrook said over the phone, trying to stay calm. The words hit me in two parts: start you Monday. A paycheck, a schedule, a reason to stop floating. But you'll need a place tonight. A door that still had to open before any of the other doors mattered. I looked through the windshield at the road stretching ahead, the sky turning that washed-out color it gets before dusk. I did quick math without wanting to. If I could find something cheap for a couple nights, I could make it to the first day. If I could make it to the first day, I could make it to the first week. The hope that rose in my chest felt almost embarrassing, like I didn't deserve it yet. I told Drew I was on my way. I told him I'd be there. I heard myself say it like it was a fact, not a wish, when I hung up. And I kept driving with both hands on the wheel and a tight, stupid smile I couldn't stop. For the first time in days, the future didn't look like a blank wall. It looked like a door that might open if I hit it at the right angle. I drove toward Grand Junction with the gas light blinking and cheap food crinkling in the seat beside me, and I let myself believe, just for a few hours, that distance could fix what Reno had done. Grand Junction didn't feel like a fresh start. It felt like a place I hadn't failed in yet. The sky was already dark, and my gaslight had been blinking long enough to make me nervous. I took the first exit with a few lights and pulled into a small lot in front of a convenience store with a faded sign, "Pinion Stop." The door chimed when I walked in. Warm air hit my face, carrying the smell of fryer oil and burnt coffee. The lighting was harsh and flat. I grabbed a basket and moved slow, checking every price tag like it was a trap. I picked up instant noodles, saw the cost, put them back. I reached for canned soup, remembered I didn't have a can opener, put that back too. I ended up with simple, cheap calories: crackers, a bruised banana, a small jar of peanut butter, and the least expensive loaf of bread on the shelf. At the register, the clerk rang me up without much interest. I watched the total climb and kept my face still. The receipt printed with a soft whine. When he handed it over, I folded it once, then again, neat, and slid it into my pocket. I wasn't sure when that became a habit. I just knew I felt better when I had proof in my hand. A coffee station sat by the front windows. I poured a small cup and drank it too hot. It tasted like bitter water, but it warmed my fingers. I stared out at the dark parking lot and tried to solve the only problem that mattered. Drew had offered me a start date, Monday, but he'd been clear that I needed stable lodging. I could do another night in the car if I had to, but my back was already screaming and I didn't want to show up to a new job looking like I'd slept in a vehicle. Now I walked back toward the register and forced my voice into something casual. "Any cheap rooms around here?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. The clerk's eyes flicked up, then away. His shoulders shifted in a half shrug, like he didn't want to own the answer. Before he could say anything, a voice came from behind me, low and dry. "There's a little cabin spot, cheap if you don't ask questions," Mrs. Nadine Holt muttered. I turned and saw her at the end of the aisle with bottled water, a small basket in her hands, gray hair pinned back, puffy coat, face lined in a way that made her look permanently unimpressed. She didn't smile. She didn't look cruel either. She looked like someone who saved her energy for what mattered. I didn't crowd her. I just listened. The clerk returned to his screen like he hadn't heard a thing. Nadine talked like it was local trivia. A cluster of small cabins out past the edge of town where the streetlights thinned and the roads went quiet. Cheap for a reason, and people didn't stay long. She didn't explain that part. She didn't have to. She told me you didn't book it online. You drove out and dealt with a guy who had the keys, the kind of deal that was simple as long as you kept it simple. She looked me over once, quick, like she was deciding whether I'd bring trouble back to her. Then she gave me the only instruction that sounded like it mattered. "Tell Cal you just need 2 nights," she added, as if it was a favor to him, not me. Cal, a real name, a real person. That should have felt normal. Instead, it made my stomach tighten because real people could say no, and I didn't have time for no. 2 nights would get me to Monday. Monday would get me to my first shift. That was all I needed to think about. I nodded and thanked her without turning it into a scene. She paid for her items and walked out into the night without looking back. I stood there with my cheap groceries, my folded receipt pressed flat in my pocket, and a direction that felt like a thin rope tossed down to someone in a pit. I didn't stay long enough to overthink it. I walked out, got back in the car, and started driving toward the edge of town. 2 nights, just 2 nights, just 2. Juniper Flats wasn't hard to find, which made me nervous in a way I couldn't explain. Nadine's directions had been simple, almost careless, like she'd sent me to a diner instead of a place that barely existed. I drove past the last cluster of businesses, past a couple dim motels and a bar with a flickering sign, and the town thinned out fast. The streetlights spaced themselves farther apart, the road narrowed, the houses stopped looking lived in and started looking like structures people used when they needed to, then left alone when they didn't. My headlights swept over scrub and low trees. The air felt different out here, colder, drier, like the edge of town was a line you could step over and leave the rest of the world behind. I rolled the window down a crack to keep myself awake. The smell that came in was sharp and dusty, unlike cold dirt and peon needles. The cabins appeared without ceremony. 3, maybe 4 small units set back from the road, dark shapes with shallow porches. The lot was gravel, uneven, and my tires made a crunching sound that felt too loud in the quiet. There were no welcome lights, no signs pointing to an office, no friendly little numbers posted on poles. Just the cabins, a few bare trees, and a building to the left that looked like it used to matter. A sign hung over it, crooked, letters worn and faded. Hearthstone Property Office. The sign looked like it had been bleached by years of sun and winters. A metal pull gate covered the front door, drawn down like a shutter. One of the windows had blinds half tilted, not open, not closed. The whole building had that half-dead feeling. Like it was waiting to be torn down, but nobody had gotten around to it yet. I parked and sat there with the engine running, hands on the wheel, watching my breath fog the windshield. There were no cars in the lot besides mine, no porch lights in any of the cabins, no movement behind the office windows. I told myself this was fine. People rented cabins like this all the time, off-season places, cheap places, places that didn't bother with charm. Still, the quiet pressed in. It wasn't the normal quiet you get in a neighborhood at night. It felt deliberate, like the area was holding its breath. I killed the engine, and the silence snapped into place. The ticking from my cooling hood sounded like footsteps for a second. I got out, stretched my back, and felt the stiffness argue with me. Gravel shifted under my boots. I turned toward the cabins, scanning for any sign of someone, a light, a cigarette ember, anything. Nothing. Then a door opened somewhere to my right, not loudly, just a soft creak, wood on wood. A man stepped out of the shadow between two cabins like he'd been there the whole time, waiting for the sound of my car. He wasn't old, maybe late 30s or early 40s, but he moved like someone who didn't waste energy. Average height, lean build, dark jacket zipped up, hands bare despite the cold. His face didn't show much. Not friendly, not hostile. Just blank, like a clerk at the end of a long shift. He walked toward me without hurrying, stopping a few feet away like he'd already measured the distance he wanted. He didn't offer a handshake. He didn't ask my name. 2 nights, cash or transfer, Cal Mercer said without looking up. His eyes flicked to my hands, then my car, then the office building, like he was counting exits. I swallowed and reached for my wallet. I didn't want to fumble. I didn't want to look desperate, even though I was. I asked him what the rate was with my voice steady, then handed over the cash I'd already counted twice in the car. He took it and tucked it into his pocket without counting it in front of me. That should have bothered me. Instead, it felt like relief. Counting would have made it feel official, like we were signing something I couldn't undo. He pulled a key from his jacket pocket, one key, plain, on a small ring with no tag. He held it between 2 fingers like it was nothing, like it wasn't the difference between a bed and another night hunched over a steering wheel. Behind him, the hearthstone office sat dark. I couldn't stop looking at it. The sign, the gate, the blinds that looked like they hadn't been touched in months. It didn't fit with the idea of renting out cabins. It looked abandoned, but not forgotten, like someone still cared enough to keep it closed. I nodded toward it before I could stop myself. "What's with the office?" I asked, nodding toward Hearthstone. Cal's expression didn't change. He glanced at the building like it was a rock or a tree, something that had always been there and didn't deserve attention. "Old name. Doesn't matter," he said quietly, like he didn't want the word to stick. He turned and started walking without making sure I was following. I grabbed my duffel out of the back seat and went after him, crunching across the gravel. He led me to the last cabin on the right, smaller than the others, untucked a little farther back. A 6 was painted on a small plaque by the door. The porch boards looked worn but solid. A single porch light fixture hung above the door, but it wasn't on. Cal stopped at the steps and pointed at the lock. He didn't say anything else. He just waited while I stepped up and slid the key in. It turned a little rough, like the mechanism hadn't been used much. The door opened with a faint drag, swollen wood rubbing the frame. Cold air spilled out, stale and flat, like the cabin had been sealed for a while. Cal didn't follow me inside. He stayed on the porch, hands in his jacket pockets, eyes drifting out toward the dark lot. I stepped over the threshold and flicked the light switch. A single overhead bulb came on, bright enough to be unkind. The room was small, one narrow bed against the wall. A little kitchenette corner with a mini fridge and a microwave. A tiny table with one chair. Bare walls except for a generic framed print that could have been anywhere. Nothing personal, nothing welcoming. Just functional. The smell was the first thing that made my throat tighten. Not rot, not mold, just stale air and old wood and the faint chemical bite of something used to clean fast. It smelled like an empty place pretending it wasn't empty. I set my duffel on the bed and listened. The mini fridge didn't hum. The overhead light buzzed faintly. Outside, the quiet pressed against the thin walls like a hand. On the table sat 3 things arranged like someone had taken the time. A ceramic saucer, plain white with a small chip on the edge. A glass jar, clean, empty, with a metal lid sitting beside it, and a single sheet of paper, squared and centered like a note left for a guest. I didn't pick it up yet. I stared at it from a few feet away and felt that familiar heat of embarrassment creep up my neck. The part of me that wanted to believe I was normal, that this was normal, pushed back hard. This was just a cheap cabin. This was just 2 nights. This was just me being tired and jumpy because I'd let my life collapse. Outside, Cal cleared his throat once. The sound cut through the room like a reminder. I turned and walked back to the doorway. He was already stepping off the porch. He didn't ask if I needed anything. He didn't point out where the towels were. He didn't tell me checkout time. He just walked away across the gravel, swallowed by the dark between the cabins. The quiet closed behind him like it had been waiting. I shut the door and locked it. Not because I thought he'd come back, because it made my hands feel like they were doing something useful. Then I walked back to the table, stood over the saucer and the jar, and finally reached for the rule sheet like it might be warm, like it might already know my name. The paper was clean, not folded, not wrinkled, bright white under the overhead bulb, like someone had printed it and placed it here 5 minutes ago. No logo, no letterhead, no friendly welcome message, just a title line in plain black type and a list underneath it. I read the first line once, then again, because my brain didn't like what it was seeing. At first, I tried to make it normal. Cheap cabins had rules. Don't smoke. Don't bring pets. Don't leave food out. Lock the door. Don't bother the neighbors. I could have handled that. I wanted that. Something ordinary that said, "You're a guest and we don't want you wrecking the place." This wasn't that. The list wasn't long, but it was precise in a way that made my skin tighten. Times, specific actions, specific words. It read less like house rules and more like instructions someone wrote after learning what happened when you did things wrong. I told myself the obvious explanation. Maybe they'd had theft. Maybe they'd had someone who wouldn't leave. Maybe the area was sketchy at night, and this was Cal's weird way of keeping guests safe without having to deal with them. But the more I stared, the less it felt like safety. It felt like control, like somebody had decided there was a correct way to exist inside this room, and they'd written it down so I couldn't pretend I didn't know. My eyes flicked to the table again. The saucer sat dead center, chip on its edge like a broken tooth. The glass jar was empty, lid beside it, mouth open like it was waiting. And my folded receipt from Pinion Stop pressed against my thigh in my pocket, piece suddenly heavier than it should have been. I read the rules again, slower this time, letting each sentence settle. Rule 1. Put the key on the ceramic saucer. Don't keep it in your pocket. Don't take it outside. Rule 2. If someone says your full name correctly from outside, don't answer. If they get it wrong by 1 letter, say "not me" exactly once, then stay silent. Rule 3. Don't use the tap water after 9:09 p.m. If you hear dripping when the faucet is off, place an upside-down cup over the sink and leave the kitchen area until it stops. Rule 4. Every receipt from that day goes into the glass jar before you sleep. Don't crumple or tear them. If you don't have a receipt, put a blank sheet of paper into the jar. Rule 5. At 3:13 a.m., there will be an audit. Stand in the hard light under the ceiling fixture, hands open with palms facing out. Count slowly to 60. Don't look at the floor. Don't look at any mirrors. I held the page in both hands and felt my thumbs press into the paper. I didn't like how the rules made my mind jump to images. Someone outside saying my name, my full name, the faucet dripping when it shouldn't, a jar filling up with little pieces of proof. An audit at 313 like this place was a business, and I was an entry in its books. I glanced toward the bathroom door in the back corner. It was shut. I hadn't even opened it yet, and I already didn't like the thought of a mirror in there. I looked back at the ceiling fixture. The light was harsh, bright enough to carve a rectangle on the floor. Hard light, the rule called it, like the person who wrote it wanted me to notice. "This is ridiculous," I said quietly, but I still set the paper down like it could bite. The words didn't make me feel better. They just made the cabin sound smaller, like it had heard me and stayed quiet on purpose. My heart was beating a little too fast for no reason, or for a reason I didn't want to name. I took the key out of my pocket and placed it on the saucer. Metal on ceramic made a small, clean sound. Then I pulled out the folded receipt and set it beside the jar, not inside yet, like I was bargaining with myself. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to roll my eyes and crumple the paper and go to sleep like a normal person. Instead, I stood there, staring at the rules, feeling the weight of how tired I was and how badly I needed this place to be simple. Just follow it, I told myself, and hated how natural that sounded. I moved through the cabin like I was trying not to wake it up. That sounds stupid, but it's what it felt like. Every step on the floorboards had its own soft complaint, and the overhead light made the room look too sharp, too honest. The bedspread had that cheap motel texture, rough under my palm when I pressed down to test the mattress. The kitchenette corner was bare, except for a stack of paper cups and a plastic-wrapped set of utensils. The mini fridge sat silent, not humming, not doing anything that would prove it was real. My duffel went onto the bed first, because that's where it always went when I didn't have a better place. I unzipped it and pulled out the basics: toothbrush, deodorant, a wrinkled hoodie, my folder of documents that I'd been guarding like it was a second heartbeat. I lined them up on the table for a second, then shoved the folder back into the duffel, because leaving it out felt like inviting trouble. I wanted to shower even though I was tired. Part of it was comfort. Part of it was the idea that I could wash the last few days off my skin and pretend this was just a stop on the way to something better. The bathroom was small and colder than the main room. The mirror over the sink was clean, which almost made it worse. I avoided looking straight at myself anyway. I turned on the shower and waited until the water warmed, then stepped in and let it hit the back of my neck. The water pressure was weak but steady. I kept the shower quick, because quick showers are what you do when you're camping, and the campsite doesn't feel safe. I dried off with a thin towel that smelled like detergent, pulled on clean clothes, and stood in the bathroom doorway for a second, listening. No sounds from outside, no footsteps on gravel, no car doors, just the faint buzz of the overhead light and my own breathing. Back in the main room, I ate standing up. Crackers with peanut butter smeared on them in thick, uneven globs, the kind that stick to the roof of your mouth. I thought about heating something, then remembered I didn't have soup that didn't need a can opener. I drank water from the bottle I'd refilled earlier and told myself it was a meal. Calories are calories. That's what you tell yourself when your life is a math problem. The rules page sat on the table where I'd left it, too neat, too centered. The saucer and the empty jar sat beside it like props. I kept glancing at them while I ate, like they were watching me. When I was done, I wiped my hands on a paper towel and stood there staring at the saucer. The key was still in my pocket. I'd put it there out of habit when I locked the door, and now my hand kept brushing the spot like it was checking on a bruise. I pulled it out and held it for a second. Plain metal. Cold. Nothing special. The kind of key that shouldn't have rules attached to it. "Okay, key stays here," I muttered, placing it on the saucer like an offering. The sound of metal on ceramic was small, clean, almost polite. I hated how that tiny noise made me feel better, like the cabin had accepted a payment. I pulled my folded receipt from my pocket and held it between my fingers. Pinion. Stop, printed at the top. The date. The total that I'd tried not to look at while paying. I could have thrown it away like a normal person. Instead, I unscrewed the jar lid, undropped the receipt inside, and watched it settle at the bottom like a dead leaf. The jar looked ridiculous with one slip of paper in it, like a museum exhibit. I tightened the lid, then sat down on the edge of the bed and tried to breathe like a person who had a room and a door and an address. The overhead light kept pulling my attention. It was brighter than it needed to be, harsh enough that the corners of the room looked flattened. The light cut a rectangle across the floor, hard-edged like someone had drawn it there with a ruler. I didn't like the way it made the room feel divided into zones, bright and not bright, safe and not safe. That was my brain being dramatic, I told myself. I was tired. I was wired. I'd been sleeping wrong and eating wrong and living wrong for days. Of course, my head was looking for patterns. I checked the time on my phone. The battery was higher now, charging off an outlet by the bed. The signal was fine. That almost made me laugh, the normalcy of it. I could scroll, I could search, I could call someone. I didn't. I opened my messages and stared at Maya's last text, the one I'd answered earlier, and thought about sending something else, something honest, something that didn't make me sound like a liar. I closed the app instead and set the phone face down. Around 9, I started getting sleepy in that ugly, uneven way you get sleepy when your body's been running on adrenaline. My eyes felt heavy, but my mind kept twitching. I stood up and paced once from the table to the door and back, then stopped because pacing made me feel like a trapped animal. I turned off the bathroom light, left the overhead light on, and sat on the bed again. Without thinking, my hand patted my pocket for the key. It wasn't there, obviously. It shouldn't be there. Rule 1. I stared at my hand like it had betrayed me. My fingers brushed the fabric again, searching for a shape that wasn't supposed to exist. My stomach tightened and I looked at the table. The key was on the saucer. Still there. I let out a slow breath, annoyed at myself. Then I noticed something that made me sit up straighter. The key wasn't sitting the way I remembered placing it. When I'd dropped it, it had landed near the chip on the edge, angled slightly, the ring resting against the saucer's rim. Now it sat closer to the center, straighter, like someone had lined it up. I stared until my eyes started to water from not blinking. I told myself I'd remembered it wrong. I told myself I'd moved it without noticing. I told myself I was tired enough that my brain was making up details to fill empty space. All of that was possible. All of it was reasonable. None of it made the tension in my shoulders ease. I forced myself to look away. I got up and walked to the kitchenette corner, not because I needed anything, but because standing still felt worse. The faucet sat above a small sink, metal dull under the light. I checked the time again. 9:03. Rule 3 started at 9:09. I wasn't thirsty. I didn't need to wash anything. I just stared at the faucet like it might move. I set a cup on the counter, right side up, then picked it up again and turned it over in my hand, practicing without knowing I was practicing. That was the worst part. How quickly my body started accepting the idea that rules mattered. At 9:08, I stepped away from the sink and sat at the table. I watched the clock on my phone tick. 9:09 hit and nothing happened. No sound, no drip, no shift in the air. The cabin stayed exactly the same, and I felt stupid for expecting a cue. I waited another minute, then 2. My eyelids drooped. My head dipped once and snapped back up. I rubbed my face with both hands and forced my eyes open. Then I heard it. Drip. A single drop, sharp enough to cut through the quiet. I froze and listened. Another drip followed, then another, steady, like a slow metronome. I got up and walked to the sink. The faucet was off. Both handles were turned tight. I checked them anyway, twisting until the metal bit into my fingers. The dripping continued, as if my touch didn't matter. Rule 3. I grabbed the cup, flipped it upside down, and placed it over the drain like I was covering something I didn't want to see. The cup made a hollow sound when it settled, and for a second the dripping sounded louder, like it was hitting the inside of the cup and amplifying. I stepped back, left the kitchenette area the way the rule said, and stood by the bed. My heart was beating hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. The dripping continued for a few beats, then stopped so abruptly it felt like someone had turned a switch. The silence that followed wasn't comforting. It felt expectant, like a pause after a question. I stood there a long moment, then forced myself to move. I went back to the table and sat down, trying to make my body relax. I stared at the jar, one receipt inside. I stared at the saucer, the key still in the center, perfectly placed. The overhead light continued to carve the floor into bright and not bright. I checked the door lock. I checked it twice. I checked the window latch. The cabin had curtains, thin ones, and I pulled them closed even though the outside was already dark. I didn't want to see my own reflection in the glass. I didn't want the glass to show me anything else. When I finally lay down, I left the overhead light on. I didn't tell myself it was because I was afraid. I told myself it was because the cabin felt unfamiliar and I wanted to read my phone if I woke up. That was the lie. The real reason was simple. Light made me feel like I wasn't alone with the dark. Sleep came in pieces. I'd drift for a few minutes, then jerk awake because my brain thought it heard something. Once it was the wind, maybe. Once it was the building settling. Once it was nothing at all, which was the worst. Sometime after midnight, my hand went to my pocket again, searching for a key I wasn't allowed to have. I stopped myself halfway, forced my hand to the blanket, and stared at the ceiling until my eyes burned. That's when the voice came. "Jack Wheeler," a voice called from outside, calm enough to sound familiar. I sat up so fast my neck screamed. The sound had come through the walls like the speaker was close, just beyond the porch, not shouting, not whispering. Calm, certain, like someone who knew I was there and didn't need to prove anything. I didn't answer. My mouth went dry instantly. I held my breath and listened for footsteps on the gravel, for the creak of porch boards, for anything that would explain it. Nothing. A few seconds passed, then the voice returned, the same tone, with a small change that made my stomach drop. "Jack Whaler," the voice tried again, and it sounded amused this time. The rule snapped into my head like a hook. "Wrong by one letter. Say, 'Not me,' exactly once. Then stay silent." I didn't want to say anything. I didn't want to engage. But the rules weren't asking what I wanted. They were telling me how to survive, and the cabin had already proven it could make water drip without touching the faucet. "Not me," I said, and my mouth went dry immediately. The words felt stupid the second they left my lips, like I was playing along with a prank I didn't understand. Then the cabin went dead quiet. Not just normal quiet. The fridge still didn't hum. The light buzz seemed to fade for a few seconds. Even the air felt still, like the room was listening back. I stayed frozen, waiting for the next sound, the next test. Nothing came. After a handful of seconds, the normal quiet returned, and my lungs finally remembered to work. I exhaled slowly, then forced myself to lie back down. I didn't sleep. Not really. I stared at the ceiling and counted minutes until I couldn't tell if time was moving. I checked my phone. 2:41, 2:58, 3:07. Each number made my chest tighten more. I hated how much I wanted to be wrong about the next part. At 3:10, I sat up. My legs felt heavy, like they belonged to someone else. The rectangle of light on the floor was still there, hard-edged, waiting. I swung my feet down and stood, barefoot on cold floorboards. I looked at the jar on the table and the key on the saucer, and I felt like I was in a room where every object was part of a test. My phone clock rolled closer. 3:13, I whispered, staring at the clock like it was a threat. When 3:13 hit, the ceiling light didn't just stay bright, it seemed to sharpen, like the bulb found a new intensity. The rectangle on the floor looked cleaner, straighter, almost too perfect. Hard light, the rule had said. I stepped into it and felt exposed in a way that didn't make sense, like standing there meant something. I held my hands up, palms facing out, fingers spread. I didn't like the position. It felt like surrender. It also felt like proof. 1, 2, 3. I counted and tried to keep my breathing from turning into noise. I counted slowly, forcing each number out in my head even though my lips wanted to move. 10, 20, 30. My heart beat against my ribs like it was trying to get out. Around 40. Till I heard something faint from the direction of the table. Not a voice, not a footstep. A soft sound like paper sliding against glass. The jar. The sound was tiny, easy to dismiss. It could have been the receipt settling. It could have been the lid cooling. It could have been nothing. I kept my eyes forward. I didn't look down at the floor. I didn't turn toward the bathroom. I held my hands steady even when my arms started to ache. 50, 55, 60. The moment I reached 60, the light returned to normal, not dim, just normal. The hard edge of the rectangle softened like it had never been there. My shoulders sagged so hard, it felt like my bones dropped an inch. I lowered my arms and realized my palms were sweaty. I stumbled back to the bed and sat down too hard, breath coming shallow. The cabin was quiet again. But it didn't feel like a room anymore. It felt like a system that had just finished doing something to me and moved on. I lay back without turning off the light. I didn't check the jar. I didn't check the key. I didn't go to the sink to see if the cup was still upside down. I just stared at the ceiling and waited for my heart to slow down. Eventually, exhaustion won. Not cleanly, not gently. I drifted into a thin sleep with my jaw clenched and my fists half closed, like I was still following rules even in the dark. I woke up with the overhead light still on and my mouth tasting like metal. For a second, I didn't know where I was. Then, I saw the hard little table, the narrow bed, the curtain I'd pulled tight, and the memory of standing in that rectangle of light snapped back into place. My arms felt heavy, like I'd done push-ups in my sleep. My hands were stiff from holding them up too long, palms out, like I was surrendering to something I didn't understand. I sat up slowly and waited for my neck to decide whether it was going to cooperate. Outside, it was gray and quiet, not the kind of morning noise you get in a neighborhood. No kids, no dogs, just distant road sound and a wind that didn't seem to touch the cabin walls. I looked at the table without meaning to. The key was still on the saucer. The jar sat where I'd left it. The rule sheet lay flat, its corners perfectly aligned with the table edge, like it hadn't been touched all night. I didn't check the sink. I didn't go see if the cup was still upside down. I didn't want to confirm anything. Confirmation felt like commitment. Instead, I dressed fast, brushed my teeth, and kept my eyes off the bathroom mirror like it had the power to make the night real again. By the time I left, I'd convinced myself it was exhaustion and a weird rental and my brain trying to make patterns out of stress. The lodge was 10 minutes away by car. The drive took me past the edge of town and back into something that looked like a place people planned to be. Signs, businesses, a coffee shop with lights on. The world looked normal, and I clung to that like a life raft. I parked in a small lot with a few other vehicles and sat there for a moment, my hands on the steering wheel, breathing until my pulse stopped racing. Inside, Cedar Vale Lodge smelled like cleaning solution and warm air. A lobby with polished wood and a fake stone fireplace, tour brochures on a rack, a bell on the front desk that looked like it had never been rung. I stood there feeling underdressed and too aware of my own face, like everyone could see the last week on me if they looked close enough. A woman behind the desk looked up and smiled. Her name tag read, Sienna Park. She had that practiced friendliness people wear when they deal with guests all day, even when they're tired. "You're Jack, right?" Sienna Park asked, trying to be friendly. "Yeah, first day," I said, keeping my smile thin. She pointed me down a hallway toward a maintenance shop in the back. The building was smaller than the lodge, more practical. On tools, shelving, a faint smell of paint and old lumber. Drew Hallbrook was already there, leaning over a clipboard. He looked up as I walked in and gave me a quick once-over like he was deciding how much trouble I'd be. He didn't waste time with welcome speeches. He asked if I had steel toe boots, if I could use a drill, if I knew how to read a basic checklist. I answered yes where I could and kept my voice steady. He handed me a ring with 2 keys and a laminated card with radio numbers on it. He talked while he wrote, like his brain ran faster than his mouth. The schedule, the expectations, the simple rules that actually made sense. Don't leave tools out. Don't borrow equipment without signing it out. Don't disappear without telling someone. He mentioned lodging like it was just another box that needed checking. Just show up, or do the work, and keep your head down. Drew Hallbrook told me, like he'd said it to himself before. He gave me my first task right away. Tighten a loose handrail on the back stairs, replace a broken doorstop in a supply room, patch a scuffed wall in a hallway where someone's luggage had scraped it. Small fixes, the kind that made the building feel cared for without anyone noticing. I liked that, in a way. There was something honest about work that didn't require me to be impressive. It just required me to be present. My hands stayed busy. That mattered more than I realized. When your mind has nowhere to hide, it starts replaying the night, the voice outside, the dripping, the light that sharpened like a blade. But when you're tightening screws and measuring lengths and sanding a wall, your thoughts don't get to run wild. They have to stand in line behind the next step. By mid-morning, my forearms ached in a good way. My shoulders loosened. I started to feel like a normal person again, the kind who had a job and tasks and a supervisor who didn't know my past. I told myself that was the whole point of coming here. New place, new story. Leave the rest behind. I took my lunch break in the most practical way possible. I walked 2 blocks to a small deli that looked like it lived off locals. Fluorescent lights, plastic tables, a handwritten menu. I ordered the cheapest sandwich they had and a small bag of chips. I watched the cashier ring me up and felt my eyes go straight to the receipt printer like it was a magnet. When the receipt came out, I folded it neatly and slid it into my pocket. I didn't crumple it. I didn't throw it away. I told myself it was just because I might need it for budgeting. That was a lie. The truth was simpler. The cabin had trained me in one night, and I hated that it had been so easy. Back at the lodge, Drew had more work lined up. A hinge that needed tightening, a lock that didn't catch right, a bulb replacement in a hallway sconce that required a ladder and patience. I kept moving. I kept saying yes. I didn't talk much. The less I said, the less chance I had to sound like someone who didn't belong. By late afternoon, My shirt stuck to my back and my hands smelled faintly like metal and dust. Drew signed off on the last task and told me where to be in the morning. He didn't ask personal questions. He didn't ask why I'd moved here. That felt like mercy. I sat in my car before driving back to the cabin and let myself breathe for a minute. The day had been normal. That was the strange thing. Normal work, normal people, normal tiredness. For a few hours, the cabin felt like a bad dream I could shrug off. Then I opened my bank app. The screen loaded and my balance appeared with a small line underneath it, marked pending. The name beside it wasn't the lodge, it wasn't the deli, it wasn't the convenience store, Hearthstone Property Services. The amount wasn't huge, but it was enough to make my stomach tighten. It looked like a processing charge, a deposit hold, something that would clear in a day or two and disappear. It's probably nothing, I muttered when I saw the pending line, even though my stomach disagreed. I stared at it until the numbers blurred, then backed out and locked my phone. I told myself it was cabin-related. Cal had taken cash, sure. But maybe there was an additional fee. Maybe Nadine's cheap if you don't ask questions came with some paperwork in the background. Maybe this was how cheap places stayed cheap. Fees that hit later, quiet and inconvenient. The drive back to Juniper Flats should have felt easy after a full day of work. My arms had that honest soreness from lifting and tightening and hauling things where they belonged. My shirt still smelled faintly like dust and paint. For a few hours, my head had been too busy to wander. I'd almost convinced myself last night was just exhaustion and cheap lodging and my brain making a big deal out of a couple weird noises. That confidence started draining the moment the road slipped away from the last stretch of streetlights. The buildings thinned. The traffic disappeared. The air outside the car looked darker than it should have, like the dusk had pooled out here and stayed put. When the gravel lot finally came into view, it didn't look like a place I was returning to. It looked like a place I was being let back into. My headlights swept over the cabins in a slow arc. No porch lights, no cars besides mine, no movement. The Hearthstone property office sat off to the left with its faded sign and metal pull gate, the same half-shut posture it had last night, like the building was holding a breath. The quiet was thick enough that even the crunch of my tires sounded too loud. I sat in the driver's seat with the engine running and watched my own reflection float in the windshield. I told myself to get out. 2 nights, I reminded myself. I just had to make it through tonight, then I'd have a job and a routine and the cabin would turn into an ugly story I told myself later. I killed the engine and the silence snapped tight around the car like a lid sealing shut. The walk to the door felt longer than it should have been. My boots ground into the gravel. The key was cold in my hand. When I unlocked the cabin and stepped inside, the stale, sealed-in smell hit me exactly the same way it had the first time, like the room had been empty the entire day and was proud of it. I flicked the overhead light on, and the cabin jumped into harsh brightness. Everything was in place, the bedspread smooth, the chair pushed in, the table centered, the saucer on the tabletop like a little altar, the glass jar beside it with the lid on tight, the rule sheet lying flat, squared, like it hadn't shifted a millimeter. The neatness felt wrong, not comforting. Wrong, like someone had reset the room the moment I left. I set my duffel down, then noticed the cup at the sink. Still upside down, right where I'd left it last night. Seeing it made my stomach tighten because it meant last night hadn't been a dream. Or I hadn't imagined myself following a rule. I'd done it. My deli receipt was folded in my pocket, warm from my body heat. I pulled it out and held it between my fingers. It was stupid how much comfort a thin strip of paper could give me. It proved I'd been out in the world. It proved I'd eaten lunch like a normal person. It proved today had happened. I went to the table, picked up the jar, and unscrewed the lid. The metal threads rasped softly, and the sound seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have. I tilted the jar and saw my first receipt sitting at the bottom, exactly where it had dropped. Good. Normal. I slid the deli receipt in and watched it flutter down and settle on top. For one clean second, relief hit me so hard I almost laughed. 2 receipts in a jar, that's all. Or a dumb rule I was following because I didn't have the energy to fight anything else. I started to screw the lid back on, then my eyes caught a third slip, half hidden under the bottom receipt. It wasn't printed like a store receipt. The paper was too white, too smooth. The font looked like something you'd see on a form, not on a thermal printout. I froze with the jar still in my hands. My pulse jumped high and stayed there, and the cabin suddenly felt smaller, like the walls had leaned in. I set the jar down slowly, as if a sudden movement might change what was inside. I reached in with 2 fingers and pinched the edge of the extra slip, careful not to crumple it. The paper slid out with a faint whisper against glass. My hands started shaking before I even read it, like my body already knew. The top line said, "Occupancy Audit." Under it, within smaller letters, name confirmation, and beneath that, centered and clean, like it had been stamped by a machine that never made mistakes, Jack Wheeler. My skin went cold, not chills, not a shiver, cold like blood pulling back from my fingers. I stared at my name until it stopped looking like a name and started looking like a label on a box. I flipped the slip over, blank, no logo, no address, no barcode, nothing that tied it to a place I could call or a person I could argue with. Just paper, perfect and quiet. "That wasn't there," I said, and my voice came out too small. My mind raced for explanations that didn't break reality. Maybe Cal had a spare key and came in while I was gone. Maybe Nadine had been wrong and there were cameras and rules and paperwork that went with the rental. And maybe the slip had been there since the start, and I hadn't looked closely enough last night because I was tired and scared and acting like a person in a survival mode. But I remembered the jar being empty. I remembered holding it up under the light and seeing clean glass. I remembered how ridiculous it felt to trap a receipt in there like evidence. That memory was sharp enough to hurt. "You're tired. You're seeing things," I insisted, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I set the slip down on the table, then picked it up again immediately, like letting it go meant it could disappear and I'd never prove it existed. My phone sat on the bed. For a second, I wanted to call Maya so badly my chest ached. Just hearing her voice would pull me back into something normal. I wouldn't even have to tell her everything. I could say I hated this cabin. I could say I was stressed. She'd tell me to leave. She'd tell me I was being dumb in the way only siblings can. Then I pictured myself trying to explain the slip. Occupancy audit, name confirmation, my name printed like a stamp, a jar on a table, rules that predicted it. I imagined the pause on the other end of the line, the careful questions, the worry that wouldn't go away. Worse, I imagined her hearing fear in my voice and believing it. "No, I'm not calling anyone," I muttered, because saying it out loud made it feel like control. I slid the slip back into the jar, screwed the lid on tight, and left it on the table like I'd sealed something toxic inside. Then I sat on the edge of the bed with my boots still on, staring at the jar until my eyes burned, waiting to see what it did when it realized I wasn't looking away anymore. I treated the cabin like it was a job site, because that was the only way I could keep my head from spinning. If I could turn it into steps, then I could pretend it was manageable. I could pretend it was just weird, not wrong. I did everything early. I didn't wait until I was tired and sloppy. I didn't wait until the fear started talking louder than my common sense. I took the key out of my pocket and set it on the ceramic saucer, dead center, like placing it anywhere else might count as disrespect. I twisted the glass jar open and made myself look inside before I dropped anything in. My Pinion Stop receipt and the deli receipt were still there, folded and ordinary, and the white slip sat among them like a tooth. Occupancy audit, name confirmation, Jack Wheeler. Seeing it in the jar instead of in my hand made it feel worse, about like it belonged there. I dropped the deli receipt back in without thinking, even though it was already in there, then stopped and stared at my own fingers on the rim of the jar. I didn't pull it back out. I didn't fix it. Fixing it felt like negotiating with the cabin, and I didn't want to give it that. I screwed the lid back on until the thread squeaked, then wiped my palms on my jeans like I'd touched something dirty. The blank sheet of paper was still near the microwave, part of a little stack of cheap cabin supplies. I tore one off and laid it beside the jar, perfectly flat. Rule 4 backup, like a spare tire. I hated how it made me feel prepared. I hated how it made me feel like I'd done this before. I moved the cup closer to the sink so I wouldn't have to cross the room searching for it later. I checked the time on my phone and decided I wasn't going to touch the water at all, even before 9:09. I didn't trust myself to remember the exact minute. I didn't trust the cabin to care whether I did. I took 2 small sips from my bottle and set it down like the sound might matter. I didn't cook. I didn't heat anything. I ate 2 crackers with peanut butter standing by the bed and forced myself to swallow even though my throat kept tightening. The whole time, my eyes kept drifting to the overhead light. It made the room look too crisp, too exposed. The rectangle it cast on the floor was hard-edged, like a cutout. The first night, it had felt like a coincidence. Now, it felt like the cabin's way of measuring space. I tried sitting on the bed and immediately felt my body begging for sleep. That was the problem. And sleep would make me careless. Sleep would make me late. The rule didn't say I had to stay awake, but my gut did. I set an alarm for 3:12 anyway, then left my phone face up on the table where I could see the time without lifting it. Hours passed in slow, ugly chunks. I scrolled through nothing. I opened my bank app, stared at the pending line from Hearthstone Property Services, then closed it again. I kept replaying Drew's voice from the phone call, the normalness of it, the way a real job sounded. It was the only anchor I had. If I could make it through tonight, I'd wake up and go to work again and keep building a life that didn't involve jars and audits. By 8:58, my shoulders were already tense. I sat at the table with both hands wrapped around the coffee cup I hadn't refilled, just holding it for warmth. I watched the clock creep toward 9:09 and tried to keep my breathing even. When the minute turned, nothing happened right away. I waited, almost hopeful. 30 seconds. A minute. Then, without warning, a single drip hit the sink, sharp and bright in the quiet. I turned my head so fast my neck twinged. The faucet was off. The handles were turned all the way tight. Another drip fell, then another, steady enough to become a rhythm. I didn't go closer at first. I just watched it from the table like staring could make it stop. The bead formed at the spout tip and dropped. It wasn't imaginary. It wasn't a settling pipe. It wasn't random. It was doing it on purpose. I stood and moved like I was under surveillance. Cup in hand, I crossed to the sink, flipped it upside down over the drain, and stepped back out of the kitchenette area exactly like the rule said. The moment the cup settled, the sound changed. Not louder, not quieter, different, softer, like the drops weren't landing on metal anymore, like drops landing on thin paper. That thought hit me so hard I almost laughed, because it was too specific and too insane to be my imagination. I stood by the foot of the bed, eyes fixed on the kitchen line like there was an invisible boundary, and listened. The dripping sped up for a few beats, then slowed, then stopped in a clean cut like someone had flipped a switch. The silence after felt like approval. It made my skin crawl more than the dripping did. I sat back down. I didn't move the cup. I didn't go check the sink. I just watched the jar on the table, the saucer, the blank sheet of paper waiting beside them like a signature line. Time crawled again. Midnight came and went. My body started to sag. My eyelids kept slipping. Every time my head dipped, I jerked it back up, angry at myself, scared of what I'd miss. I stood under the overhead light for a while, letting its harshness keep me awake. The rectangle on the floor looked sharper when my feet were inside it, like it recognized me. Around 1:30, I caught myself patting my pocket for the key. The reflex felt pathetic. I yanked my hand away and stared at my own fingers like they'd betrayed me. The key was on the saucer, right where it belonged. I forced myself to look away from it because staring felt like an invitation. A little after 2, the cabin got that heavy kind of quiet again. Not normal quiet. A pressure quiet, like air before a storm. I tried to tell myself it was my nerves. Then, the voice slid into the space outside the cabin without any sound of approach. It didn't start with my full name. It started with my first name, soft and conversational, like someone calling me over from a porch. That was the strategic part. It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't an announcement. It was a hook. I stayed still. I kept my eyes on the table. The voice tried again, adding my last name, speaking it clearly, like it belonged on paperwork. Jack Wheeler, the voice said again, and it sounded closer than the yard should allow. My mouth went dry instantly. I didn't answer. I didn't even swallow. I waited for the one-letter mistake, because at least the rules gave me a script for that. The voice paused, then tried it, the last name off by 1 letter, like it was testing whether I had learned the lesson. "Not me," I said, and felt stupid the moment the words left my mouth. The key trembled. It wasn't a dramatic rattle. It was a small, precise vibration, like a phone buzzing. The metal ring ticked once against the ceramic, then the key went dead still again, perfectly centered. My eyes locked onto it. My heart thudded hard enough that the room seemed to pulse with it. I stood up, crossed to the door, and checked the lock without opening it. I tested it twice. The wood was cold under my palm. I pressed my ear to it and heard nothing. No footsteps on gravel, no shift of weight. The voice had come and gone like a signal, leaving the cabin to react on its own. When I turned back, the saucer was empty. The chip on the edge looked like a little wound, exposed. For a second, my brain refused to accept it. I stared, expecting the key to appear as soon as I blinked. It didn't. My hands moved toward my pockets on instinct, then froze halfway. Digging for the key meant admitting I might have it on me. Keeping it. Breaking Rule 1. I didn't know whether the cabin cared about intent, but I wasn't willing to find out. I scanned the floor, under the table, beside the bed. Nothing. The cabin stayed quiet, but it felt watchful now, like it was waiting for me to make the wrong choice. Then I heard it. A soft, metallic touch from the far corner near the cabinet by the mini-fridge. A tiny clink, like a ring tapping wood. I walked toward it slowly. The key lay tight against the baseboard, half tucked into shadow, like it had been pushed out from under the cabinet with a careful shove. I crouched, reached for it, and hesitated. Picking it up meant touching it. Leaving it there meant the key wasn't on the saucer. Either way, the rule was being tested. I picked it up. My fingers closed around damp, icy metal. It wasn't just cold from the room. It was ice cold and wet, like it had been held under running water. A drop slid down my thumb. My fingertips went numb almost immediately. I carried it back to the table and set it on the saucer, dead center again, like returning a piece to a board game. Metal on ceramic made that same clean, polite sound. The key sat still. I didn't feel relief. I felt like I'd just complied with something that didn't deserve compliance. I reached for the jar next because my gut told me the jar was the real trap. The key was just a handle. The jar was the record. I twisted the lid off and tilted the jar toward the light. My throat tightened as I saw what was inside. The jar wasn't just holding my receipts anymore. It was full of clean white slips stacked and layered, all the same size, all the same crisp paper. My real receipts looked small and dark in the middle of it, buried under official-looking forms. I poured a few onto the table and my stomach turned as I read them. Occupant, Jack Wheeler. Status, pending. Audit time, 3:13. It repeated again and again like copies. The same words, the same format, the same cold certainty. One slip had an extra line at the bottom. Clearance. Required. I didn't know what clearance meant here, but I knew what it meant anywhere else. It meant you don't belong until you're approved. It meant the system was preparing to finalize something. I checked my phone time. 2:57, 16 minutes. My hands shook as I stuffed the slips back into the jar, not because I thought closing the lid would fix anything, but because I couldn't stand seeing them spread on the table like a case file about me. I screwed the lid on hard and stared at the blank sheet of paper beside it, the one thing I hadn't used yet. At 3:10, I stood up. My legs felt stiff, and the overhead light seemed to sharpen again, like it was anticipating its cue. The rectangle on the floor looked too perfect. I stood just outside it and waited, heart pounding, eyes flicking to the clock. 3:13. The ceiling light burned harsher, like the bulb had found a higher setting. The bright patch on the floor shifted slightly, a subtle slide across the boards, aligning itself to where I stood. It wasn't much movement, but it was intentional. And that intention hit me harder than any shadow would have. I stepped into the light. I raised my hands, palms out, fingers spread. My shoulders started to ache almost immediately. Stay in the light, I whispered at 3:13, because I needed rules more than sleep. I counted slowly. 10, 20, 30. The cabin felt rigid around me, like the walls had tightened. Behind me, paper slid against glass, not faint this time, clear, deliberate, like someone sorting files. Then came the tick, small and sharp, like a stamp striking damp paper. Tick, pause, tick again. I kept counting. I kept my eyes forward. I didn't look down at the floor, even though my body screamed to check what was at my feet. I didn't look toward the bathroom, even though the thought of the mirror made my skin crawl. 40, 50, 60. When I hit 60, the light softened back to normal. The bright patch stopped shifting. But the cabin didn't relax. The air stayed tight, like a latch had clicked and refused to reopen. My phone buzzed. I grabbed it with shaking hands. The bank app loaded slower than usual, like it was thinking about whether to show me the truth. Then, the pending line appeared, larger now, big enough to hurt. Hearthstone Property Services, name confirmation. My stomach dropped so hard, I felt it in my knees. A confirmation wasn't a hold. It was a final step. If it cleared, it wasn't just money leaving my account. It was my name being logged in whatever this place considered official. My eyes went to the blank sheet of paper beside the jar. The rule gave me a doorway, not a loophole exactly, a procedure. If you don't have a receipt, put a blank sheet of paper into the jar. So I'd assumed it meant missing proof of a purchase. Now it felt like it meant something else, a substitution, a replacement, a different entry. I grabbed the pen from the cup near the microwave. I uncapped it with my teeth because my fingers were shaking too hard. I leaned over the blank page and wrote one word, neat and cold. Vacant, I said quietly as I wrote it, like I was signing something back to the dark. I unscrewed the jar lid and dropped the paper in. It slid between the slips like a wedge. For a second, nothing happened. The cabin held its breath. Then, the overhead light shifted, not flickering, sliding. The hard rectangle moved off center, slipping away from where I stood like it had lost its target. Outside, the voice tried to speak again, but it came out wrong, choked and broken like a radio losing signal. It didn't form my name. It didn't form anything. It just failed. The pressure in the cabin eased slightly. Not safe, just less locked, like a latch had slipped. I didn't wait for it to correct itself. I twisted the jar lid back on tight. I popped it open once more, just long enough to pull a single audit slip out and shove it into my wallet, because I needed proof that I wasn't losing my mind. Then I sealed the jar again. I packed fast, not neat, not thoughtful. Jacket, duffel, documents, charger. I left food behind. I left the cup over the sink. I left the rules sheet on the table because touching it felt like touching a contract. I kept the key on the saucer. I couldn't bring myself to put it in my pocket now, not after what the cabin had done with it. When I opened the door, the air outside was colder than I expected. The sky was starting to thin toward gray at the edges. Near dawn, not morning. The lot was empty. No silhouettes between cabins, no footsteps, no waiting car. Just quiet. I walked to my car with my head down, duffel strap biting into my shoulder. As I reached for the driver's door, I glanced toward the Hearthstone office without meaning to. One window was lit, a single square of pale light behind half-tilted blinds, like a records room where someone had come in early to file paperwork. No shadows crossed it, no movement, just light, steady, and indifferent. I got in, shut the door, and started the engine. The heater blew cold at first, then warmed. My hands shook on the wheel. I backed out slowly, then turned toward the road and followed it out, gravel crunching under my tires. I'm leaving, I told myself. And this time it sounded like a decision, not a wish. I didn't stop until the sun was fully up and the cabins were behind enough miles that my hands stopped shaking on the wheel. Even then, I kept checking the rearview mirror like the road might change its mind and bring me back. The town thinned out again, and the highway opened, and I followed the signs toward the first stretch of cheap lights I saw. The motel wasn't anything special. One story, thin walls, a front office with a buzzed-in window, and a tired-looking soda machine out front, the kind of place that smelled like bleach and old carpet and didn't pretend it was cozy. The clerk barely looked up when I paid. I didn't ask questions. I didn't want a story. I wanted a door that locked and a shower that ran and a room where the overhead light didn't feel like a measuring tool. Inside, I dropped my duffel on the floor and stood still for a second, listening. The room hummed with normal things. The refrigerator buzzed, the air conditioner clicked, a muffled TV played somewhere down the row, ordinary noise, and it made my eyes sting. I took a shower hot enough to redden my skin and let the water pound the back of my neck until my breathing slowed down. When I stepped out, the mirror fogged, and I stared at my own blurred face without recognizing it right away. I dressed in clean clothes, sat on the edge of the bed, and pulled my phone out with both hands like it might bite. The bank app loaded. My balance showed up. I tapped the pending transactions and felt my chest tighten as I waited for the line to appear. It wasn't there. No Hearthstone Property Services, no name confirmation, no occupancy transfer. Nothing pending except the motel charge I'd just made, sitting there like a normal bruise. I refreshed the screen twice, then a third time, because part of me needed to see it disappear more than once. The line didn't come back. I didn't feel relief. Relief would have meant it was over. What I felt was something closer to dizziness, like the world had shifted slightly and left me trying to find my balance. I pulled my wallet out and opened it. The audit slip was still tucked behind my debit card where I'd shoved it. Bright white paper, crisp edges, occupancy audit, name confirmation, Jack Wheeler. I pressed my thumb to the printed letters, half expecting ink to smear. It didn't. The paper felt warmer than the rest of the wallet, like it had been sitting in sunlight. That was impossible. It had been against my body all morning, sure, but warm like that wasn't normal. I left the wallet open on the bedspread and stared at the slip, trying to decide what to do with it. Tear it? Burn it? Throw it away in a gas station trash can and drive until the day ended? I couldn't make myself touch it again. Not yet. It felt like a receipt for something I hadn't agreed to buy. After an hour of sitting and doing nothing useful, I tried to prove to myself the cabin had been real, not to validate the fear, to validate my sanity. I opened my Maps app and typed Juniper Flats cabins. Nothing. I tried just Juniper Flats. It suggested a neighborhood in another state. I typed Hearthstone Property Office. Nothing again, except a few unrelated results miles away. I zoomed in and tried to trace the route from memory, the turns, the thinning street lights, the last stretch of businesses before the edge. The roads looked normal. Too normal. No marker, no cabin icons, no office pin. It was like the place had never existed on the map, like I'd driven into a blank space and come out with bruises. I told myself maps were imperfect. Rural areas didn't always show up. Businesses didn't always register. That explanation lasted maybe 30 seconds before it collapsed under its own weakness, because even a dirt lot tends to exist somewhere. I drove back toward town anyway, because I needed a human answer. I parked outside Pinion Stop in the afternoon and walked in with my hands in my jacket pockets, trying to look like a guy who was just passing through. The store looked exactly the same as the night before. Harsh lights, fryer smell, same aisles of overpriced snacks. The clerk behind the register wasn't the same guy, though. This one was a woman with her hair pulled back and a tired face that didn't invite conversation. I waited until no one was at the counter. Then I leaned in slightly, like I was asking a simple question. "Where's Nadine Holt?" I asked the clerk, trying to sound casual. She blinked once, slow. Her eyes moved over my face like she was searching for context. Then she shook her head. "No one by that name works here," she said quietly, like she'd answered it before. My stomach tightened. I tried to adjust, tried to keep it light. Maybe she was a regular. Maybe she shops here. Maybe she lives nearby. The clerk didn't change her expression. She didn't ask why. She didn't offer suggestions. She just stared at me in a way that made me feel like I'd said the wrong thing in a place where wrong things were remembered. I bought a bottle of water I didn't need just to end the moment, and the receipt printed and slid out. My fingers folded it automatically. I caught myself doing it and felt a cold little twist in my chest. I left the store without looking back. In the car, I opened my wallet again. The audit slip was still warm, not hot, just warm in a steady, stubborn way, like it carried its own heat. I drove for hours with it like that. I checked it at stoplights, at gas stations, in motel rooms. Each time I touched it, it felt faintly warm, like something alive that had learned to imitate paper. It stayed that way for 3 days. On the 4th morning, I opened my wallet and touched it, and it felt normal. Room temperature. Lifeless. That should have been comforting. Instead, it made my skin prickle because it felt like a decision had been made without me. The printed line with my name started changing after that. Not all at once, not a dramatic vanish. Just a slow fade, like the ink was being erased by time that wasn't time. The edges of the letters softened, the boldness thinned. The name Jack Wheeler became harder to read each day, like someone was scratching it out carefully, so carefully I wouldn't notice until it was almost gone. I didn't tell anyone. Not at first. I kept driving, putting miles between me and the edge of town, trying to build distance like a wall. For the next few days, I kept showing up at the lodge like nothing happened, because I needed the money and I needed to pretend I was normal. I worked for a while at the lodge, long enough to get one paycheck. Then I left without giving a reason. I told myself I was chasing better hours. I told myself I didn't want to settle. The truth was, I couldn't stand sleeping anywhere that had a ceiling light. Maya kept texting. Not often, not dramatic, just enough to remind me that someone still knew my name for the right reasons. One night, after I'd pulled into another motel and sat on another bed with the TV muted, I finally texted her back. "I'm okay. I'll call soon." I texted Maya and stared at the warm paper in my wallet like it was alive. The lie tasted familiar. The comfort did too. The part I don't say out loud is this. Ever since Juniper Flats, I wake up close to 3:13, not always exactly. Sometimes 3:12, sometimes 3:14, close enough that my body knows before my mind does. I'll jolt awake with my heart already running, and for a few seconds I'm back in that cabin, standing in hard light with my hands open, waiting for a stamp I can't see to hit paper I can't touch. Then, the room around me comes back. Motel walls, a different ceiling, a different light. But my palms will be damp anyway, and I'll lie there staring up, counting to 60 in my head just to feel like I still get to choose something.